everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emma Whiteman, and I'm Senior Content Marketer and Tech Writer here at Triumvirate Environmental. I'm so excited to be your moderator for today's Service Spotlight. These Service Spotlights are a bit different than our webinars. You'll hear a quick presentation from our expert before we turn it over to a lengthy Q&A session, and we'll wrap up at 2:45 Eastern. Our informative long-form webinars are still offered. Before we get started, I'd like to share that everyone's mics and cameras will be turned off for the entirety of the webinar. You can use the questions tab on the right side of your screen to communicate with us and ask questions. Please keep in mind that you will receive a copy of the slide deck and the recording in the days following the event conclusion if your question goes unanswered. Today we continue our Service Spotlight series with Lab Services, and I'm so pleased to introduce today's speaker, Clare Costello. Clare Costello is a Lab Services Manager with Triumvirate Environmental. A Triumvirate veteran of over half a decade, Costello started with Triumvirate Environmental as an environmental specialist, working in this field on crucial lab services tasks. Throughout her tenure, she has seen it all when it comes to safe and compliant lab practices, and this experience primes her to help manage our on-site support teams in a way that supports our clients' safety, waste disposal, and operational efficiencies. So, without further ado, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Clare.
Hello. And thank you for the introduction, Emma. Thank you everyone for joining today to learn a little bit more about Triumvirate Lab Services. Our Lab Services is the project work that's completed by our environmental specialist group. So today we'll cover all of our different service offerings and a few reasons why you may need them at your site. We'll go into a deeper dive into each service just to give a little bit more detail. And then we'll follow up with a summary and success stories. And then finally, we'll finish up with a Q&A session. We offered several different services under this umbrella term of lab services, and we have a dedicated team of around 15 environmental specialists that help with lab packs, which are chemical packaging and disposal, chemical relocation, which is chemical packaging and transport to a new site or facility, decommissioning projects that are caused usually by a closure or after a relocation, as well as high hazard projects and DEA disposal. There are a lot of reasons why your site may be in need of one of these services, but some of the most common reasons that we see are when sites need to move facilities, whether they're expanding or downsizing, or if there are lab renovations, chemicals need to be relocated to new lab facilities. If there's a professor retiring that has collected a lot of chemicals throughout their tenure, these can become very old and expired and pose a hazard for new students or PIs that are moving into the space. Changing experiments or pivoting research can often lead to obsolete chemicals that are just left to sit on the shelves and no longer needed. And this can also pose unnecessary safety risks in the lab. We have clients reach out to us that have excess chemicals after a lab closure or if they're preparing for one, and also a result of lab relocations. And they have to return the previous lab to basically as good as new. And we've had success preparing lab spaces for upcoming audits, whether those are internal or external audits. And then we also help with routine waste management to help maintain compliance with your generator size. For example, central accumulation area, routine lab packs are very common, especially if there are no routine on-site support services to help manage it. We usually will be able to set up recurring lab packs monthly, quarterly, or by request to help keep you compliant. Another common reason is just routine management of your chemical inventory or a reconciliation to remove some of those old, expired, or never used chemicals that are just posing a hazard that could be avoided. So now we can jump in a little more in depth on the purpose, procedures, and benefits of these lab services. Starting with our most common type, which is lab pack. The purpose of a lab pack is to help manage disposal for any hazardous waste or chem storage areas for labs, hospitals, high schools, universities, and manufacturing facilities and others, really anywhere where there's hazardous material that needs to be removed. The pack process starts out with a scope, so whether a list is sent to us through an Excel inventory, pictures of the waste area work, or an on-site scope and walkthrough are very common as well. And once the scope has been determined, we'll schedule a date and the team will arrive on site and we'll separate and group the chemicals by DOT hazard, such as flammable, corrosive, toxic. And they will also consider RCRA and facility requirements as well to determine which chemicals can be grouped together. And if there are smaller unknown chemicals, they can also perform a series of field tests to identify the hazards, and then they'll package them all up in approved containers and label per the DOT requirements. Bio-waste and universal waste are also commonly included in lab packs. And the team will drive a small box truck to site, and those are permitted to ship hazardous waste. And the individuals on the team are also licensed to transport haz waste. So they'll typically ship everything the same day. Lab packs help sites stay compliant with generator size. They can help keep labs safe as possible by removing unnecessary chemicals, and can help prepare the lab for any type of audit, whether it's the EPA, fire department, or we've also been asked to come prepare the space for internal, corporate, and EHS audits as well. Another very common service is our second most common service is a chemical relocation, which we refer to as a lab move. The goal of these are to safely package all of the non-waste chemicals and move them to a new location. This could be an internal move, like across the hall or onto another floor in the same building, and also commonly an external lab move, which would be over public roads to new buildings where we'd have to follow DOT regulations. And similar to the lab pack, these types of projects will begin with a scope. Typically, an on-site walkthrough is best since there can be a lot more coordination and logistics involved in a relocation. And once scheduled, the team will come to site in their box truck. They'll safely package the chemicals per DOT requirement, and then they'll label the drums and chemicals according to where they're destined to end up at the new location. We also help with temperature controlled materials in fridges and freezers. And if those units need to be unpacked, we can move that as well. We won't be able to move the equipment itself, but we'll be able to move the contents. And we help with ambient and benchtop chemicals as well. The benefits of working with Triumvirate on a lab move is our training and expertise. As I mentioned, they're the second most frequent type of project that we help with. And the team really specializes in these moves and packs. And they can ask the right questions, and they're very used to collaborating with relocation project management firms and moving companies on a regular basis. The team also emphasizes safety, and they're trained to pack and unpack these drums in the safest way possible. They're trained to handle any spills or leaks that may occur during transit as well. Another service that Lab Services plays a very big part in is our decommissioning services. For a decommissioning project, the purpose is to comply with regulatory and lease requirements, and the lab will usually need to be returned to its original or good as new state. This usually follows a closure or relocation event, and it can also involve many services and vendors to bring the space back to that good as new way. Lab Services' role in this type of project is either to help with the relocation and the final lab pack and clean out as well. So our team will help remove any chemical, biological waste, universal waste, and even household cleaners, wastewater chemicals, and other chemical supplies that wouldn't normally fall into the lab reagent category. And a good part about Triumvirate, and something that I've noticed makes a big difference in the client's experience during these projects, is that there are several of these services that are required to shut down a space, and Triumvirate can help with many of them. So including biosafety cabinet decontamination, equipment, fume hood, and surface decontaminations, as well as the final site assessment and decommissioning report. And while Lab Services itself doesn't directly perform all of these other services, we are meeting and communicating frequently with all of these other service lines, and it really does help the projects run more smoothly. Another one of our lab service offerings is our high hazard management and disposal. And while these projects are a little less common, we have small teams that are highly trained to handle high hazard chemicals and situations. And the team can help dispose of any material that might be very toxic, reactive, anything unstable. Some of the most common high-hazard projects that we come across are old and expired peroxide-forming chemicals. There are unstable chemicals or material that's an unstable byproduct of accidental violent reaction. And we encounter different unique and unsafe combinations and waste streams. Explosive material and other material that might require permit for treatment. And sometimes a facility will require certain dangerous and reactive chemicals to be shipped in smaller charges or smaller containers. So the high-haz team can help break those down into the smaller containers so that the facility will accept them. We also see a lot of unknown chemicals that we can help characterize on site through a series of field tests. Any container under 4 liters or 500 grams solid can usually be tested on site. Well, some of those larger containers we're required to pull a sample and we'll send those for analytical. This isn't an all-encompassing list of the high-haz, so if you do have something at your site that I did not list and you're worried about, feel free to reach out. Finally, our lab services team assists with the DEA material disposal. Anything expired or unwanted that falls into this category. The material is highly regulated and an approved DEA witness will be required at every step of the disposal process. So from pickup to shipment to witnessing the actual incineration. And we have a team of specialists that are approved by the DEA who can witness these parts of the process. And if you have a DEA registration number and license, we can help with what is called reverse distribution. For the reverse distribution process, Triumvirate can receive the material, store it securely, and then arrange for a witness destruction, and then help with any documentation and reporting the destruction to the DEA. If there's no DEA license, the DEA regulated material is considered to be abandoned. So a police officer would need to witness us receiving the material, counting and documenting it during the pickup. And occasionally we can also denature material on site just to render them non-recoverable, although that's a lot less common and also requires a police detail if the material is abandoned. And the benefits of this service are that we can help with the paperwork and documentation, and we can help make a very complicated disposal process a little bit easier through this reverse distribution. So in summary, clients choose Triumvirate Lab Services for expertise, focus on safety, and then also the comprehensive solutions of having one vendor help with multiple services within a project. Our field staff really do become experts in RCRA, DOT, and TSDF facility requirements, and they're always kept informed and trained as regulations change. They can help to maximize cost saving through more efficient waste routing and packaging chemicals together to reduce the number of pieces that we have to ship out. And these skills can take a lot of time and repetition to learn. So having the lab services manage all these nitty-gritty details can help save you time and hopefully some stress too. The team also has a very high focus on safety, and they're encouraged to slow down and think when posed with an unsafe situation. So it's important to have trained professionals handling these chemicals, trained in OSHA, emergency response, EPA, and DOT regulations. And they're very familiar with the safety risks associated with handling chemical waste because they do it every day. Their expertise just helps to minimize hazards during chemical relocations, lab packs, closures, and as well as high hazard risks, and they're equipped to handle spills in the moment. There's also a benefit to having the same vendor handle multiple services. We really get to know the site, and it can make the lab pack, move, decommissionings, and other special projects run a bit more smoothly. It's really helpful to have one single point of contact, which would usually be the technical services rep assigned to your account or the project manager. And the internal communication can help make these multi-service projects run more smoothly. There'll be less delays between phases, less downtime, and also the unnecessary costs associated with that. Some of those bigger, more complex projects can end up coming a little bit lower in cost if we have a faster timeline, and that's mostly due to fewer gaps in communication and site knowledge. And I have a few examples of some successful lab service projects that we completed recently. This first example was a pretty major lab and facility closure, which can be very stressful for EH&S, operations, and leadership, and it includes orchestrating multiple services and many vendors to get the building closed. This particular client had multiple rooms of chemicals. Everything was very old. They had a very short deadline to turn over the space, and so these old expired peroxide formers, broken and damaged batteries, unknowns and unknown cylinders, really anything you can think of. And then halfway through, they found an old facilities closet, which had the pile of bulbs, lamps, batteries, and e-scrap. And this project included even more services, including a small relocation portion, the BSC decon, contaminated glove boxes need to be decontaminated, equipment and surface decons, as well as their wastewater system. And even though there were a few unexpected challenges, the teams were all really able to communicate and ask questions to get over these hurdles. And different Triumvirate services were able to overlap to shorten the project as much as possible. The client really highlighted our team's focus on safety and PPE, and they were happy with how openly the team asked questions whenever there was something uncertain or if something new popped up. So at the end of this project, what the client really expected to be very stressful and messy ended up being much smoother of a transition than they had expected. We also recently worked with a client who was new to our services, and this was one of the more complex lab that I'd seen. There were a lot of unique and reactive materials. They had just removed all of these from their glove box, and everything really needed to get out of the lab as soon as possible. This was originally scoped as a 2-phase lab pack, and at the last minute, they decided they needed to combine both phases into one longer lab pack to meet their deadline, which did take a little bit of logistical coordination by the on-site team, but thankfully, the team had reached out to us early to communicate the change, and we were able to extend the project and finish it all in one go. And after the project finished up, the client noted the team's strong understanding and care about the chemicals and hazardous waste management, and how the lead really went above and beyond to answer his questions about every step, explaining disposal options, and also giving some context behind their decisions, and ultimately why it was best to combine both phases into one longer phase. And the client specifically said they had been in the field for 15 years dealing with various companies, and they said that they really never had a team take the time to explain it in detail, which is really a success story for us, because one of our bigger team goals is to value even when we're only on site for a short time, and hopefully just to leave a lasting impression, ultimately making it a positive experience. One last example here was one of the chemical relocation projects that we were on recently, which can be very stressful for the lab, especially when there's a short timeline. And this particular lab was very large. There were a lot of desiccators. There were several floors of chemistry labs, all different types of material and hazards. And throughout the project, they were still sort of in the process of stopping science, figuring out where chemicals needed to go in the new lab, still figuring out which chemicals were moving, which chemicals were being disposed of. But we were able to coordinate and schedule with all of these lab groups so that every day really ran smoothly, and there was minimal overlap of the vendors on site every day as well. And at the last minute, they also realized that they could not actually move the refrigerator and freezer units, but the material inside needed to move. So the units had to be unpacked and moved on dry ice and ice packs. And the team ended up coming back to the warehouse midday, grabbing coolers and dry ice, and making sure that everything could get over to the next site safely. After this job, the client shared a really nice message saying that the stressful, complicated project really turned into a positive experience. And this specific relocation required the lead specialist on site to be very on top of communication with all of the different lab groups, other vendors, the dock managers, EH&S, as well as the project managers. And they did a really good job just keeping everybody informed. And ultimately that led to the success of this relocation. All right, thank you everyone for joining and listening to the presentation. Now is a good time to move into the Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claire. That was an incredible presentation. It was full of awesome information all about our lab services. We do have a ton of questions coming in, so I'm going to jump right into them. One of the questions that came in was, what are the options when volumes are unknown of various lab chemicals and there's potentially no list of lab waste that you guys can refer to? Is that something that we can manage, or how would one go about managing that situation?
Yeah, if there's no list, we can usually still prepare a quote or a scope based on photos, and also on-site scopes are very helpful as well.
And what about like a lab sample that's unknown because some of the labels were taken off? Is that a similar situation?
We definitely see this a lot. That would be something we would consider to be an unknown, and anything over 4 liters and 500 grams would need analytical, but anything smaller, we would be able to field test on site and determine what the hazards are and send that for disposal.
Okay, awesome. That's great. And someone here is asking what precautions are needed or what best practices you can offer for storing a chemical in a lab versus on like a factory floor or somewhere else.
So the permitting can be very different between a research lab and a warehouse or factory facilities. Factory chemicals are more like large bags, palletized material, totes, drums. These usually require a special spill containment, ventilation, and these are usually in spaces that are more accessible by forklift. There's lower diversity of chemical hazards, and there's definitely different storage permitting than in a research lab. In labs, you're seeing much smaller quantity bottles, under 5 gallons, much higher diversity of chemicals and hazards, and they're also stored much closer to where they're used. So on the benches, in the fridges, and it's highly regulated storage in labs. But also we do have a consulting service who can help with this situation. So if I didn't answer the question, feel free to reach out and we can definitely connect you with someone who might be able to answer it better than me.
That's a great note. I should say that Claire's email is listed on this slide. So if you have facility specific information, you can reach out there and we will see what we can do for you. But thanks for that answer, Claire. That's great. Someone here's asking, there's a lot of questions about lab packs. So one of the first ones I'm seeing here is, what precautions does someone need to take to pack up reagents while a lab pack is going on or while they're moving labs?
So for a lab move, one of the most important things is just making sure that all of the containers are very tightly closed, setting aside anything damaged, anything that's unknown. Sometimes it also helps to do sort of a bigger lab pack prior to the move or following the move. Consolidating the chemicals all into one area, grouping and labeling by the end location, like the bench number, the lab number, storage room, any specific flammable cabinet or fume hood. Assuring cold material temperature storage at the new site. So when the chemicals are moved by Triumvirate, but maybe the units are being moved by the moving company, it helps to have a temporary fridge set up at the next site or a cold room so that it makes the logistics a little bit easier. But ultimately, we would normally have Triumvirate personnel be the ones that are packing up the reagents. So I would not recommend attempting to move them yourselves, but this is something that we can definitely help with.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. That makes sense to not want to do it yourself with all these like precautions and everything that needs to be taken. Here's another question coming in regarding like frequency of lab packs and yearly chemical inventorying. And then on top of that, like not only how frequent, but also are there any suggestions you have for backwards planning notifications to stakeholders regarding these upcoming projects and tasks?
So in terms of planning, we can definitely set up recurring projects for the full year. We can have the dates set up ahead of time, and our team can reach out when it's upcoming to request a scope. And then internally, it would help to send a notice a few weeks ahead of time to give the lab personnel time to collect everything if necessary. But it's definitely recommended to do a routine lab pack just to make sure that the labs are as safe as possible.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And here's like a similar question. This is more on the chemical inventory side, but when someone has inventory in their lab that isn't technically expired, but it hasn't been used in like forever, is there a general rule for removing it from an inventory after a certain amount of time, or any best practices that you can recommend for that?
I don't believe there's a set in stone rule, but definitely recommending at least an annual reconciliation or sort of audit of your expired, old, compromised chemicals. And then maybe a quarterly clean out of expired and high haz or compromised chemicals. And doing it regularly can definitely also help avoid some of these larger scale cleanouts that require temporary increase in generator status. And they can also help a little bit with budget management too, to do them routinely. And I recommend maybe if they haven't been used in the past 3 to 5 years, they're unstable, reactive, explosive, unknown. But again, it's mostly up to your lab personnel as well.
Sure, that makes sense. That's an interesting note about the generator status and stuff like that too. So it's great to hear there's, precautions in place for that. And we often talk about chemical inventory management, but what about, someone here is asking, like, what about inventory management for consumables or additional lab materials, not just chemicals? Is there anything in place for that?
We do have an inventory service, and I think they would probably be best to answer that question. But please feel free to reach out and we can absolutely connect you with the right people to get an answer to that question.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Someone here is saying that their facility doesn't have a lab, but some of these services that you described sounded familiar. Would someone who doesn't have a lab still need to use lab services?
Yeah, definitely. We help with all sorts of chemical disposal at clients who aren't necessarily a lab. The one important aspect is to have an EPA ID, so making sure that you're able to ship the hazardous waste, an EPA ID is necessary.
Okay. Is that something that, do you know off the top of your head if we can help folks get, or is that something that has to be done internally, the EPA ID?
I believe the client will have to request it, but it's definitely something that we can help facilitate.
Cool. Awesome. And then here's a question about like a decommissioning or lab packs in general, since we're kind of on the topic of it, but would a lab pack ever be useful outside of a lab decommissioning, or is it only really to, finish off a lab's life?
Yeah, most of our lab packs are outside of decommissioning projects. Many are just routine inventory management, regular central accumulation area disposal to maintain compliance with generator status. And there are changes in chemicals needed, and also when people are preparing for an audit or a relocation.
Great. Cool, thank you. And someone saying, sorry if I missed this, but do lab relocations really need to follow DOT regulations always, especially if a chemical is just being walked from one lab to another across a hallway within the same building?
Yeah, for internal lab moves, DOT regulations are not required. Just for external is where we would need to follow the DOT regulations. But the team will take into account compatibility when they're organizing the chemicals for an internal move, but they aren't usually packaging them using DOT containers.
And just from my knowledge, are there any regulations that the team does need to follow for like an in-house lab move, or is the DOT really the big ones when you're going on state roads?
The DOT is really the big one for an external lab move,
Sure.
and chemical compatibility is the biggest for the internal lab move.
Yeah, I'd have to imagine you wouldn't want two super explosive things next to each other or when they can react or something. Cool. How would someone know if they need a lab pack? They think they might need some services, but they're not 100% sure. Is there any way or standard in which they would know that they need that?
Yeah, I would say if you feel like you have an unsafe storage situation, chemicals are piled on each other, or there's a lot of old expired chemicals, or the lab is sort of messy and overfilled. And then also if you're coming up on a compliance date as well, would be some reasons.
Oh, like a date for reporting, or what kind of compliance date do you mean?
Like for the generator status, there's either a 90-day or 180 days that a chemical can be dated on site. So as soon as the date is written, that's kind of the date you're working with for compliance.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you. And so do these lab packs help with just liquid disposal solvents, or can they help with powders and other types of materials as well?
Yeah, really all of it. We can definitely ship solids, we can ship liquids, we can help with unknowns. So really everything.
Great. Are high hazard projects accomplished on site or at the Triumvirate environmental facility? For example, peroxide deactivation. I guess someone here, it seems like from their question, they're worried about having a high hazard project performed on their site and endangering their staff and their team. So if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, definitely. The high hazard projects are typically performed on site, and when needed, there's usually a fire department presence, and we also bring a remote opener and the correct PPE. So usually when we're opening the bottle, it's not inside of the building. For these very high haz bottles, we usually will transport it safely outside and then open it remotely.
That's great. That's very, very interesting. Like a remote opener. I've never heard of that before. That's really cool. What are some examples besides peroxide formers of some of these high hazard materials? Or maybe it is peroxide formers is like the biggest example, but what are some
Yeah,
that you've
that's
seen?
a very common one. That is the one that we are typically seeing. But if there are unstable chemicals, or if the chemical is unstable as a byproduct of a reaction, some of these unique mixed waste streams, explosive material, other material that would require permits for treatment, and then some unknown chemicals as well.
And would this cover things like cylinder management and disposal for like highly pressurized cylinders?
Yeah, cylinders are covered under just regular lab packs. They're not always considered highly hazardous.
Cool. Okay. And what are some of, I mean, you might have already answered this in the last question, but what are some of the most common high hazard materials or the most common chemical that you might not know is a peroxide former that's living in your lab?
They're mostly the flammable solvents that are NFPA 1A rated.
Mhm.
So ethers or tetrahydrofuran without any inhibitor, really old, expired.
Cool. All right, I will stay away from old expired chemicals. Do clients often use Triumvirate for all of these lab services, or do they just come to us for one or two small projects at a time?
So Triumvirate, yes, oftentimes we are used for multiple services, lab packs, lab moves, decommissioning, high has, DEA, the ones that I mentioned in the presentation, but also there are so many services, decontaminations, cleanups, and other field service tasks. There's emergency response. We can help with inventory management, consulting, routine drum or biohazard disposal, biosafety cabinet decons, trainings, and then also routine on-site support and embedded services. And I'm sure there's some that I didn't list, but
Cool. So it seems like also someone here is asking, like, it seems like there is the possibility to have ongoing support, but there is also the opportunity to have project work on an as needed basis. Would you say that that's correct?
yeah, definitely.
Cool. And then someone here is asking if the offer is scalable. So they have one facility that is very small, they have one that's a lot bigger, and they expect the smaller organization to be growing over time and needing different lab services. So are the lab services scalable, or is it kind of like a one size fits all, or what's your perspective on that aspect?
I would say Triumvirate Lab Services definitely is scalable. We do perform projects on all sizes of facilities, and we do have a focus on scalability. So we're consistently growing, expanding to meet the needs and demands and making sure that we have the right staff.
Great. And do the lab services that we offer differ by organization type? Like if someone is at a higher ed institution and then they move to a manufacturer, will the general lab services that are needed be the same, or will they vary between different types of organizations?
We would offer the same basic lab services for each client, the ones that I listed in this presentation, but the scope can definitely differ quite a bit based on the organization type. So manufacturing, chemicals, and waste are much different than a research chemistry lab or a bio lab. So it definitely differs, but we do a wide range.
Sure. And is there any difference in I mean, obviously it's the 5 services that you kind of went over in this presentation, but is there any difference in the scope or the types of services that would be needed from a small organization versus a bigger organization?
Not particularly, but some of these larger, more active organizations usually have more frequent services or additional triumvirate services or additional lab packs that need to be scheduled.
Sure.
But we offer the same for both small and large.
Great. This is kind of a fun one, but what's the most common lab service that's performed by your team?
Definitely the lab packs. Those are definitely the most frequent that we are performing. Second to that would be lab moves.
Cool. And what I see a lot of higher education people on the call, so I kind of have to ask this one, like, what's the most common one for higher ed?
For higher ed would definitely be the routine quarterly or biannual CAA disposal to maintain the generator status. Usually when the students are away is when they schedule the lab pack.
Yeah, that's interesting to think of the like shutdown periods as a great time to be performing any of these crucial lab service activities. So that's interesting that you bring that up. Someone here is also asking about here's another little fun one, but what is the craziest lab services project that you've ever been involved on, either as the lab services manager or with your time as an environmental specialist?
Yeah, it was kind of a little bit of both. It was when I was transitioning to being the manager, and it was one of the more complex projects that we've ever tackled. It was this long time PI had retired, and his inventory turned out to be 2 completely full stock rooms, just packed with decades worth of chemicals. It was pretty much stepping into a time capsule. And these weren't just old reagents sitting on the shelves, but many of these containers were extremely old. They had crystallized, they have degraded into different chemicals, and some were so reactive that simply moving them just required additional stabilization steps.
Wow.
And the scope really was months of detailed inventory, hazard assessment, lab packing. Ultimately, we ended up filling 2 entire trailers worth of lab packs just from these 2 stock rooms that he had been collecting over his years. Despite the size, though, our team really worked methodically, and it was a great opportunity for the lead lab pack specialist to practice some higher level project managing skills and organizing the trailer and keeping everything safe, compliant, managing a team every day on site, and ended up just turning the lab into a more hazard-free space, really.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Take this as a warning if you're listening on the call. Don't wait until it's years down the line and you need this crazy lab pack to go. Definitely contact us earlier than that. I'm glad you were safe in that situation, Claire. Okay, so here's one that came in. We are getting a little bit of skepticism from one person about if one vendor can really be the expert for all lab services. So I wasn't sure if you had any insight into that or the levels of training that our team gets before being involved in these projects.
The team definitely has a high level of training before going out and performing these projects, because there really can be safety hazards with handling chemicals for lab packs and lab moves and high haz. But like I said before, having one vendor to help with all of these really helps make the process a little bit more efficient and a little bit easier, having that one point of contact and just knowing that Triumvirate is communicating with each other and meeting with each other to help solve some of the problems that you might be having at your site.
Yeah, that's a great point because we do have experts across the organization. So would you find that often you're working with different cross-functional teams to make these projects happen? Or are you really, I guess the question is more of, are you working with these larger groups to create big plans for organizations, or is it more of these one-off projects that you're seeing?
I would say it's definitely more of a collaboration. I don't think any of the Triumvirate services are really siloed. Everyone is really working together, helping solve each other's problems and offering advice. It's very collaborative.
That's great. Well, we are running out of time here. So in the interest of, respecting everyone's time, we're going to pause right there. There's a couple questions that I saw come through that we will follow up on later on. But I just wanted to say a huge thank you, Claire, for answering just so many questions today and for such an incredibly informative event. And thank you to everyone who took the time to attend today and learn more about our lab services. As I mentioned earlier, you will receive an email with a copy of the presentation and the recording. So feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. And after the event, you will be directed to a short survey about your experience today. A link to the short survey will also be in the follow-up email, so keep an eye for that if you don't see it after the event. We would greatly appreciate your feedback on this service spotlight format and the event overall, including any ideas you have for future topics that you'd like to learn more about. Thanks for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at future upcoming events. Take care.